Good afternoon, and welcome to the afternoon plenary session on the first day of the 2021 Center for Urban Education Summer Education Forum, Forging Futures Through Black Education Histories. I'm James Earl Davis, the Bernard C. Watson Chair in Urban Education and Professor in the College of Education and Human Development at Temple University. First, let me give a big shout out to Dr. Elon Dancy. As the Executive Director of the Center for Urban Education at Pitt, his intellectual and visionary leadership and commitment to the Black radical tradition and its contemporary currencies gather us here today at this critical moment in our history and as we look to our futures. Thank you, Professor Dancy. I'm delighted to be one of the facilitators for this session. This session is entitled Educational Reconstructions, and it provides a unique opportunity to engage in a discussion that combines thought, perspective, and research about education histories and futures. History is always present in what we do. So by centering histories in this conversation about Black education and Black educational thought, we seek to understand historical context more broadly and deeply. And in doing so, we confront how historical foundations implicate education futures. Our goal this afternoon is to have a generative conversation about reconstructions of Black education and Black schooling practices that are informed by the historical scholarship of our distinguished speakers, Dr. Jarvis Givens and Dr. James Anderson. There are no formal presentations in this session. Rather, our conversation, discussion, and reflections will be guided by questions from the session facilitators. So please allow me to introduce our facilitators. First, we have Nakaya Washington Butler. Nakaya is a sophomore in the School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh, studying early childhood education. She's a critically engaged youth activist with a demonstrated passion for advancing change in school systems for Black youth and reimagining educational possibilities. Nakaya has also been an intern and featured panelist for the Center for Urban Education. Our other brilliant facilitator is Chris Wright. Currently, Chris is a PhD student in the Urban Education program in the School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh, where he's a research assistant in the Center for Urban Education and an Equity and Justice Fellow. His research centers Black spaces as geographic sites of political struggle and world making. Chris's scholarship also explores patterns of Black displacement and Black organized struggle. And now Chris will introduce our featured speakers for this session. Chris?
Thank you, Dr. Davis. So first, I'll introduce Dr. Jarvis Givens. Dr. Jarvis Givens is an assistant professor of education in African and African American studies at Harvard University. He specializes in the history of African American education, and his first book, Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson and the Art of Black Teaching, was published in 2021 by Harvard University Press. He was also the co-editor of We Dare Say Love, Supporting Achievement in the Educational Life of Black Boys, published by Columbia's Teachers College Press in 2018. Professor Givens is currently building the Black Teacher Archive, an online portal which will house digitized records documenting the more than 100-year history of the Colored Teachers Association. His research has been supported by fellowships and grants from the Ford Foundation, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the William F. Milton Fund, and he has published in peer-reviewed journals such as the American Education Research Journal, SOLS, Harvard Educational Review, and Race, Ethnicity, and Education. Professor Givens earned his PhD in African American Studies from the University of California, Berkeley. Thanks for being with us, Dr. Givens. Next, I'll introduce Dr. James Anderson. Dr. James D. Anderson is Dean of the College of Education, the Edward William and Jane Marr Gutzel Professor of Education, Affiliate Professor of History, African American Studies, and the College of Law at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. His scholarship focused broadly on the history of U.S. education with a subfield on the history of African American education. His book, The Education of Blacks in the South, 1860 to 1935, won the American Educational Research Association Outstanding Book Award in 1990. Professor Anderson, a member of the National Academy of Education, was also selected as a fellow for outstanding research by AERA. He was awarded the Palmer O. Johnson Award for Best Article and received AERA's highest recognition, the Presidential Citation. 2006 to 2016, Anderson served as senior editor of the History Education Quarterly. He has served as an advisor for and participant in a number of historical documentaries and films about African Americans. Additionally, Professor Anderson is a member of the Board of Trustees at Stillman College in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and was inducted into the Stillman College Educator Hall of Fame. Professor Anderson earned his PhD in the history of education from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. I am extremely excited to be in dialogue with both of you. I'll go ahead and open up the first round of questions. So my first question is going to be for Dr. Anderson. Dr. Anderson, what were some of the historical contexts that informed Black education at the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century? Specifically, I'm wanting to know if you could speak to some of the ways in which government strategies in the late 19th and early 20th century worked to suppress and disenfranchise Black people politically and educationally.
Okay, Chris, thank you for that question. I think the most important thing at the end of the 19th century is the disenfranchisement of Black voters, because from the beginning of Reconstruction, particularly military Reconstruction, up until that time, there were Black voters and Black office holders who were in positions to influence resources for African-American kids, the shape of their education, the content of their education, as well as the structure of education. And they made quite a bit of progress, roughly from 1868 to the end of the 19th century. At the end of the 19th century, when African-Americans were disenfranchised, we also witnessed a trend downward from equality. It's the onset of the Jim Crow era, the emergence of great inequality in every way, in every metric, whether it's teachers' pay or school terms or buildings or facilities. We saw Southern state governments use their newly established power on the heels of disenfranchisement to really repress African-American education. In some cases, the repression was much more brutal than in others. For instance, there was a Normal School in Holly Springs, Mississippi, that had trained 2,000 African-American teachers. And Governor Vardaman of Mississippi decided to just simply close it so that you couldn't train African-American teachers. And you had the extremes. You had that kind of repression by state government, by governors, as well as local districts on the one hand. On the other hand, you saw a distribution of school funds in such a way that African-American kids were shortchanged, African-American teachers were underpaid, schools were legally segregated in the aftermath of the disenfranchisement. So what we now know as the Jim Crow era, or what historians have referred to as the Trail of Tears or the nadir, that's the time period in which Southern whites regained control of state and local governments and used that power to repress African-American education.
Thank you for that, Dr. Anderson. My next question is going to be for Dr. Givens. And Dr. Givens, you can feel free to chime in on the last question if anything sprung up in your mind as Dr. Anderson was talking or as I posed the question. But Dr. Givens, I'm wanting to ask a couple of broader questions for you. So the first one is, what is Black education and has the meaning for it been consistent over time? The second part of that question is, do you think fugitive pedagogy is a necessity for Black education? And so I guess the third part to that question is, what is fugitive pedagogy as well?
All right, I appreciate that, Chris, that you gave me that three-part question, but very rich. And I would love to kind of pick up on some of the, to add what Dean Anderson has shared before wonderfully. And I should just also say it's wonderful for me to be able to just share space with all of you, but especially Professor Anderson, whose work has always been so central to my thinking. It was the first text on the history of Black education that I read that really helped me understand why it was important to look to the traditions of Black education to try to have a deeper, to strive for a deeper understanding of so many of the challenges that we have in education today. I just feel like I wanted to say that. But one of the things, if I was to add anything to what Dean Anderson just said, is that I would also, I think that it's important to say is that, you know, one of the things that I found to be so fascinating when learning and studying about the history of Black folks during the time period in the late 19th and early 20th century is the kind of institution building that we see happening among Black folks, despite the kind of aggressive neglect that was happening in terms of the disenfranchisement, the inequality in terms of the distribution of resources, but just the sheer number of institutions that Black folks are creating to support their educational efforts and their political strivings during this time period in the late 19th century and the early 20th century was so just important for me to kind of really grapple with and to learn about, especially thinking about, for instance, the proliferation of colored teacher associations to try to help and mitigate and respond and advocate for Black folks in response to so much of the kind of structural oppression that Black folks were experiencing. And when we think about the period that Dean Anderson referred to as the nadir. But in terms of this question of Black education, in terms of how we understand it, I think it's relevant in relationship to that tension between what was shared between Professor Anderson and what I'm trying to say about Black folks in educational striving, is that Black education has always kind of existed in that tension, right? In terms of, we know that Black folks have always valued education and have always valued opportunities to elevate their intellectual thought and to seek out ideas to help them build and to imagine new worlds. But we also know that Black education has always been targeted, right? Because of its radical potential, because it reflected in so many ways Black people's desire to strive and to transcend the social status that was externally imposed upon them through the kind of disenfranchisement, the different laws, Jim Crow laws, and also even before that, if we're talking about anti-literacy laws in the context of slavery that criminalized Black education, right? So to this point that you're asking about what is fugitive pedagogy, for me, it is an educational tradition that derived from enslaved people who pursued literacy and meaningful education by theft, right? Beginning in the context where Black education is criminalized. We know that the first anti-literacy law is established in 1740 in response to the Stono Slave Rebellion in South Carolina, and they proliferate in the antebellum period. But we know that Black folks continue to pursue meaningful education, opportunities to exert the full range of their humanity despite those restrictions. And so fugitive pedagogy is a conceptualization where I'm trying to name that political orientation to education that emerges in slavery, but that is still relevant in the post-emancipation period. Because as Dean Anderson just mentioned, there continued to be violent backlash against Black educational efforts, right? Even as Black education is no longer technically illegal, right? We know that, for instance, between 1866 and I believe 1876, over 630 Black schools were burned down. So Black educators and communities continue to be met with violent hostilities, and they continue to have to pursue critical parts of their education in secret, right? So they continue to have to navigate these oppressive forms of hostilities in the context of the American school through the form of segregation policies, but also racist and oppressive curriculum. And we constantly see Black people pursuing alternative models of education despite those strictures, right? And so fugitive pedagogy is holding in place both those constraints, but also Black people's constant straining against that confinement. And it's intentional not to overstate one or the other, because Black education has always been something where we've had to contend with both this education for freedom model, but we also know schooling has been a site for Black suffering the entire time as well. And we can't understand the meaning of Black education without appreciating both of those, both of those realms of experience.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Dr. Givens. I have a third question for Dr. Anderson. And again, Dr. Anderson, if there was anything that Dr. Givens just said that you want to speak to as well, please feel free to do so. I'm gonna pose this question first. How do you understand the connections between educational histories and educational futures for Black communities? Are there critical lessons from this historical period that has currency for contemporary Black education? And if so, how have they changed over time?
Thank you. I would like to just second what Jarvis said about the resistance and the building of institutions. That is a part of African-American history in general and African-American educational history in particular that we should always appreciate, whether it's enslavement or Reconstruction, the Jim Crow era, right on through the Civil Rights era into the present. There's been resistance on the part of African-Americans when there have been efforts to repress their education or somehow to destroy their dreams of freedom and equality and the place of education or the support of education in pursuing those dreams. And I think that I'm so pleased that he shared that part, because it's so critical that we keep that in front of us, because those are the shoulders that we stand on, and the people who built those institutions and who waged that resistance against repression. That is our history. That is the continuity between the past and the present. Now, to your question, I think one of the things that I've learned, and one of the reasons I focused on the disenfranchisement, because we at that point again. We're at a point where there are widespread efforts, self-conscious efforts, bold efforts to disenfranchise African-American voters. And what I've learned from the historical context is that African-Americans built institutions, attain a degree of relative equality when they were enfranchised. In fact, one of the things that struck me, I just sort of read it in a book by Horace Mann Bond, who did a study of, and the title was Negro Education in Alabama, because I was born and raised in Alabama and was very much looking forward to reading it. And when I was reading it, he said that at the end of the 19th century in Alabama, that the dollars that went for African-American students were the same as the dollars that went for white students. And when I read it, I couldn't believe it. I thought, no, that can't be true. Because by that time, Jim Crow had set in. Well, actually, it was about that time that African-Americans were being disenfranchised. And so when the whites got control of state governments and they built new state constitutions, those new constitutional provisions opened the way for African-Americans to be repressed and for their education to become grossly unequal. And so that was at the end of the 19th century coming into the 20th century. And of course, African-Americans were disenfranchised right through the Civil Rights Movement. That's what John Lewis and the Voter Rights Acts and the registration drives were all about, was to enfranchise African-Americans. We're now entering a period, right as we speak, where there are movements to disenfranchise African-American voters again. And my view is that the present is much like the past in this regard, that if they're able to disenfranchise African-American voters, then how much could African-American communities expect equal education? I mean, you're not about to disenfranchise a population that you're going to treat equally. The very process of disenfranchising them demonstrates the disrespect that you have for them. It also demonstrates the extent to which you want to deny their drives for freedom and equality. And so we have to keep in mind that, it's what Faulkner says, the past is not even past. So what we think of as a distant past is fact, tells us a lot about our presence, which is one reason that all over this country, African Americans should be fighting back against disenfranchisement. Because if we care about the education of our children, we want a seat at the table where all educational decisions are made. You cannot have a seat at the table if you're not in office, if you're not voting, if you're not able to make an impact on the instruments of government. If you're disenfranchised, people not only ignore you, they will mistreat you. And so I think the past tells us a lot about the present. We do not want to go back to the end of the 19th century. We do not want to go back to Jim Crow when we were disenfranchised. And our decisions about the education of our children were made at a table where we were not present. And I think that's something that we should learn from the past, we should take forward. And it should become part, not just of our memory, it should become part of our day-to-day resistance.
Yeah, if it's okay, I would love to build just kind of to think there, because I think, it's very interesting to see the efforts to kind of, disenfranchise Black folks is also happening at a moment when we know the kind of public discourse and response and backlash to what people are calling CRT and efforts to restrict how race gets taught in the context of schools is also happening simultaneously at this moment as well, right? And I think that is also instructive for us when we think about the history of Black education, right? Because the history of Black education has been about, there's the institutional history about the kind of, and thinking about access, Black schools being starved of resources, and the question about the development of institutions or the intentional underdevelopment of Black educational institutions. But we know that education is not just about the school building, it's also about the kind of ideology, the ideas, and the curriculum that's also housed within school, and that's formed the basis of curriculum in the educational project as well. And that's being heavily contested in the current moment that we see happening around us in a number of different legislative campaigns in various states. So I think that, these things happening simultaneously is something that we absolutely should be thinking about through the lens of the history of Black education, not only to understand how it's kind of, repeating certain, how the present is repeating patterns from the past in a particular way, but also it's instructive for political strategy and educational strategies of resistance as well, in terms of how have Black people historically organized themselves to navigate those kinds of constraints and to navigate that kind of power. And that should also be instructive for this moment, right? So the reason that the history of education is important is because you have to be well studied on these institutions that we've inherited, that have very long roots, right? That have mechanisms in place that people can kind of build, that people are building upon in terms of strategy of restricting Black expressions of power, right, in society, right? So it's important to be aware of that and to be well studied on it, to be able to anticipate these kinds of things, right? When you study the history of Black education, you can see the resonance, right? But it's also equally important in seeing that resonance of the restrictions and restraints that are being created, to also think about this very long educational tradition of people who, had very little, had nothing in terms of material resources after the Civil War. But it's like that part in Souls of Black Folks when Du Bois said, 750,000 did the freedmen give of their poverty, right? And Professor Anderson writes about this beautifully when he talks about that there was a value and a set of ideals and political strategies embedded in Black folks, their ideas of education that carried over to the post-emancipation period. And that also had to do with how they navigated power, how they organized themselves to resist, constraints that they were very well aware of on a day-to-day basis in ways that we can't even imagine today, right? So I think that the history is instructive for how we name and develop a political clarity about the oppression built into certain systems, but also how we can recognize resources from the past that we might take up as we build and assemble our own forms of resistance and strategies for moving forward and for building in the current moment.
And Chris, if you permit me, I'd like to add one thing to the conversation. And that is to always remind ourselves as to the question, or the answer to the question, how do we get over? And above all else, it was Black teachers. And so in the midst of this repression, in the midst of discrimination, the one inoculation we had against repression is African-American teachers. And I say that because it has so much meaning as to where we are and going forward. We have to constantly ask the question, where are African-American teachers? And how do they play a role in the education of our children? I will say honestly and with all due confession that I cannot imagine that I'm where I am today without African-American teachers. They made all the difference. Growing up in Jim Crow, Alabama, having to fight through all kinds of systems of segregation. I mean, you know, one thing I laugh about, they even had the books segregated so that white students would buy their books at one desk and we had to buy our books at another desk. Everything was segregated. But in the midst of all that, there were African-American teachers who were so devoted to helping us reach our highest potential, as Vanessa Siddle Walker book title is, that they're the ones who helped us through the nadir or the Trail of Tears. They helped us through. So for African-American children going forward, we have to always ask the question, where are the teachers by their side? And where are the teachers as exemplars? Where are the teachers that motivate? Where are the teachers that role models that help them to think they can be what their teachers are? So that's a critical question for the past and the present.
I feel like if I'm permitted, I would love to kind of build on here. We might be in trouble. I feel like this, I don't want to be in that corner, following up on that, all the gems that that Professor Anderson is dropping here. But I feel like, because it's important to the question that you ask about how the history is instructive for the present. And I think that what I hear and what Professor Anderson just said is also that we have to recraft the narrative that we have about the long Black freedom struggle in general. And because in many ways, we haven't fully appreciated the role that teachers played in nurturing and cultivating so much of the civil rights efforts and the Black power struggles that we know that we tend to celebrate, right? For instance, even if we think, and this is, you know, Vanessa Siddle Walker's work is very instructive here, is that even when we think about the Brown versus Board of Education victory, even though we know what comes after, is we have to unpack in a number of ways. But that landmark piece of, you know, that Supreme Court victory, we tend to only think about the role that lawyers played in that process, right? But Vanessa Siddle Walker's work has really helped us to think about the teachers who have been working, you know, leading up to that moment and really working in the shadows, intentionally so, right? Thinking about fugitive pedagogy because of their vulnerability and precarity as public employees, right? But we would not have a Brown decision had it not been for teachers. But also all of the leaders that we think about, or in all of the scholars that we think about, whether it be Vanessa Siddle Walker or James Anderson, or if we think about an Angela Davis, right, who talks about her education at Tuggle Elementary and the schools in Birmingham, Alabama, that planted early seeds in her mind, right? We can't understand the leadership of the people that we love to hold up individually without understanding the social emotional context that they were shaped in and that they were formed in. And when we think about that, we know that they didn't just fall out of the sky, right? They were taught by someone, and they point us to these early lessons that they received from their education and from their teachers. So that forces us to think about the role teachers played in cultivating dreams in generations of Black people. That's really at the heart of the long Black freedom struggle, right? So that, you know, forces us to think about, if we're talking about political imaginations in the current moment, we have to think about the role that teachers play in that, and we have to be intentional about how we support teachers, how we encourage people in our community to become educators as well.
I'm appreciating so much about this conversation. I appreciate how you both are pointing to sort of what it is that Black people have always been up against, but also highlighting the fact that Black people have always resisted and struggled and taken up the charge of self-determination in the face of various systems of oppression. I'm gonna go ahead and pass the second set of questions over to Nakaya. She will be facilitating the next set.
I would like to say thank you, Chris. And I would like to say thank you to Dr. Anderson and Dr. Gibson. While you guys were talking, I had questions in mind, but as the time went on and as I heard you guys speaking, something that really spoke out to me was you guys discussing African-American teachers not being present within the classroom. And as me being a sophomore in college and previously coming from high school, I can definitely state that I can list on my hands how many African-American teachers were actually present within classrooms, especially in, a lot of schools that I went to that were predominantly African-American. So my question would be, why is it that African-American teachers, especially African-American male teachers, are not present within the classrooms? And that question will go towards either one of you guys.
Jarvis, you want to go first?
Sure, I can chime in first there. I think that I would definitely want to lift up the work of scholars. We can think about Vanessa Siddle Walker, but I'm thinking about a lot of important articles by scholars like Jackie Irvin as well, that talked about the firing and the demotion of Black teachers in the way that Brown v. Board was rolled out. And we're still trying to make sense of the kind of after effects of that. But I think that kind of rupture that happened in the kind of post-Brown era with the undermining of Black educators, not recognizing them as important for the important pedagogical contributions that they had and that they had been cultivating and modeling over the course of generations. But I think that estrangement is something that continued to have ripple effects. And we've just gradually seen more and more Black teachers experiencing the teaching profession as extremely alienating, right? And I would say that also is a part of a larger deprofessionalization of teachers in general in this country. But I would say teachers of color and Black teachers in particular especially experience that in very harsh ways, right? And so I think that historical moment is something that we really have to look to. And also the fact that so many of the institutions that advocated for Black teachers and supported cultivating the professional identity of Black teachers were also undermined in what came after in the post-Brown era, right? And so you have a lot of Black educators who enter the profession with very similar kinds of motivations as the teachers that were their predecessors, right? But having nowhere near the kinds of institutional supports and professional supports that we see when we look at the history of Black teacher associations, for instance. And certainly there are other, the fact that you don't have Black teachers and supportive.
Join in at this point. And I think Jarvis used a really good term, rupture, because that's what happened to Black teachers and in the profession. There were a lot of research that was done on Black teachers at the time of Brown v. Board of Education and at the advent of the segregation. And what they discovered was often to their surprise. One, they were much more well-educated than they suspected. Because of the denial of opportunities for African American to go to graduate school in the southern states, in places like the University of Alabama, University of Maryland, or Florida, Georgia, so forth, that African American teachers would leave the South in the summertime and go to places like Columbia and Indiana University and Ohio State for their master's degrees. And so they'd gotten the best education in the best institutions. Not only did they have, not only were they well educated, studies also showed that they stayed in the profession longer than any other group in America, that Black teachers really did stay in the profession. And then came what is really revenge or punishment because of Brown v. Board of Education, that southern states and local districts decided a wholesale dismissal of Black teachers was a way to punish Black people for seeking school desegregation. And so as schools were desegregated, Black teachers were dismissed by the tens of thousands. There's a lot of disrespect. I know of a friend and colleague of mine, the late Fred Rogers, did a study of Black principals in North Carolina. And in a few years, it went from, say, 70 or 80 Black principals to 2. All the rest were dismissed. And so we had a kind of really brutal treatment of African American teachers and administrators in the aftermath of Brown v. Board of Education. Now, that rupture really created a disjunction between Black teachers continuing in the profession. They were dismissed. There were a lot of bitter attitudes about it. There was a great reluctance for them to tell their children, you should go into teaching, given what had just happened to them. And so it's almost like a stroke, where you then have to learn how to speak again, how to walk again, how to do all the things over again that you used to be so great at, that was actually, you had developed into a fine art. And so after this dismissal, after this rupture, we have been in a process for a long time of trying to rebuild African-American teachers into the profession of teaching. And we haven't talked about the word, but I will introduce it at this point, and that is reparations. These teachers were dismissed by state governments. They were dismissed by local school districts. This was not the act of some private vigilante group or some private business. This was done by state governments. And so state government has a responsibility to create the kind of scholarship and the kind of financial aid that make teaching a very attractive profession for African-American students. And one of the things we know for all teachers now, people going into teaching, the one thing that is a great obstacle is that very few people want to go and get a degree, get a license to become a teacher when they have to incur a great amount of debt and have to spend the rest of their life trying to pay off borrowed loans on a salary that is low among the professions. And so what states can do is simply decrease the cost of preparation for African-American teachers and make sure they get a full ride. They go into the profession. They have to pay no cost for room or board or for tuition. And to develop these kinds of scholarships and these kind of financial packages as a way to compensate for what they did to Black teachers at a critical moment in the history. And so we need these kinds of policies. Now, I know there are people out there who would argue, oh, that's reverse discrimination. No, it's not reverse discrimination. It's reparations for what you did as a government to African-American teachers. And I think the federal government also has a role here, because anytime Congress, at any time the courts stand by and see this happening to any group of people, they bear some responsibility in making compensation. And we've seen this with Black farmers, by the way, in the latest bills. There's been funds allocated to try to make Black farmers whole again because they were so thoroughly discriminated against over the years. Now there are people now, a group of white farmers pushing back saying, oh, that's reverse discrimination. Well, people have to understand that when something happens to you as a consequence of self-conscious decisions by state government and by local government, is not reverse discrimination to compensate for that kind of damage.
Yeah, I think that that's a very very creative way of thinking about how we use that history, reflect on that history, but also think in practical terms for the current moment about what that also means, both in terms of how we assess, what was taken and what was undermined, and what we need to kind of do to kind of like recreate things like, Black teacher pipelines, or to build and cultivate Black teacher pipelines. But one of the other things that I was thinking about is that there are all sorts of, we can talk about the loss of jobs, but then there's also something that we also have to sit and think about that was lost in that process as well, was this kind of the intellectual capital, and that just, when we think about it, when we look at the records from colored teacher associations and the meetings from these groups and these organizations that Black educators created and that they built over, the course of a century, and to think about how that rupture was sustained for such a long period of time, and to try to imagine the kind of just the intellectual capital that was also lost there as well. It's something that we have to hold on to as we also think about the actual jobs. It's like, because these were people that were not just working, but they were people who were trained, who were connected to principals and educators before them, that passed on knowledge, passed on ways of doing and being and relating to students, and developing political strategies to support themselves and also the communities that they were serving. And that's also something that we have to make sure that we don't lose sight of, is that it's not just about the number of teachers, but it's also the traditions that were undermined in that process that gave a different model of what it meant to be a teacher that had to do with shaping and nurturing the kind of professional disposition among Black educators that were affirming to them, but that also, had, positive results in terms of the impact that it had on Black students as well, right? And this is not to say that it was perfect and that is something that we try to recreate exactly in the current moment, but we also have to name the loss of that intellectual labor that Black folks have been putting in for such a long period of time in perfecting their own understandings of what it meant to be an educator, right? Because they were scholars of the practice. They weren't just practitioners just doing what people were telling them to do. They were developing ideas and creating models about new standards of what it meant to be an educator that defied conventional ideals of what it meant to be a teacher based on the kind of dominant educational landscape. And that's something that we also have to contend with as we do this work of imagining, creating pipelines and creating supports for educators today.
I would like to thank you guys for answering that question for me. That was a lot, and I would definitely like to say that it helped me understand a little bit more than compared to what I already know. But going into my next question, this will be directed to Dr. Anderson, and this question kind of focuses on your perspective on the many injustice and inequalities that are still in the education system, and what would need to happen to fix it for African Americans to be equal within the education system as of now.
Thank you for that question. We have an obligation to systematically reveal the inequities that are still within our system, and they're there. And we can take any metric. We could take buildings and facilities and see the inequality just in the kind of schools that students go to. You can go to our cities, whether it's Chicago or Cleveland, other places. You can go to our rural areas, and you look at the schools, you look at the science labs, you look at the programs, and you can see great inequalities. And many of those were exacerbated and revealed to extreme extents during COVID-19. As soon as it hit, I'm out here in Illinois, and was following what was happening in Chicago, and they needed millions and millions and millions of dollars just to make it possible for students in the city of Chicago, which is about 85, close to 90% Black and brown students, just to have the devices and the bandwidth to study online. And so those inequalities that were underlying came to the forefront. They're there. Curriculum. Most people might think if you go to a public school, you get the same curriculum. That's not true. I've done a study of things like AP courses and where they're offered and in what schools and in what districts in the state of Illinois and across the country as well. Some students have access to very rigorous and demanding courses, and it helps them in ways that people can't imagine. And let's give you a couple of points, because at one point, going back to the 1980s history of education, President Reagan had this study called A Nation at Risk, and our leaders were concerned about how our students were performing on the international tests of math and science. America was ranked somewhere like 23rd or 24th among industrial democracies, down there with Cyprus and South Africa, and everybody was talking about how poor American education is. And the Nation at Risk study said, if another nation had done this to us, we would declare an act of war. But what was little noticed at the time was that the College Board disaggregated from the same study all the students who had taken at least one AP course. And this is what the College Board told America, that for students who had taken AP Physics and scored at least a 3 on the examination, scored #1 in the world, American students. And that students who have taken AP Math, irrespective of their score, scored #1 in the world. So we had students in America who had access to the best curriculum, the most demanding, most rigorous courses, and they were doing fine. They were not only doing fine on the international test of math and science, they were doing fine on the ACT, they were doing fine on the SAT, tests that make a difference in terms of what kind of college you get into and what kinds of support you get and what kinds of scholarships you get. And so then you look around and say, well, okay, who is it that doesn't have access to this kind of curriculum? Well, it's disproportionately Black and brown students that don't have access. So the curriculum is not the same. We look at teachers in terms of advanced degrees. We look at mobility of students. And one of the things when they were looking at the achievement gap, I never forget, because the Educational Testing Services did 2 studies. And what they found in their first study was that for Black students who took math and science, they took math and science that for 1/3 of them took math and science for teachers who did not major in the subject. And so what they were telling us is, why would you expect these students to score as well on the test in math and science when they're disadvantaged from the beginning? They're taking the course with some people who didn't even major in the field. And so when you go in and you really look at equality of curriculum, equality of teachers, equality of structures of schools and science labs and so forth, we have these gross inequalities that are still there, still with us today. And a lot of these things we can control. We can control the quality of facilities and buildings. That we can control. We can control the quality of teachers that are placed in schools. We tried this with No Child Left Behind by saying that at a certain point, if teachers didn't have a major within the field, they would be dismissed. Well, that's going by the wayside. That's not about to happen because there's such a shortage. There's not a time to think about dismissing teachers. But anyway, the point I want to make is that people might think that, you know, children leave home, they go to pre-K, they go to elementary school, go to high school, and they have more or less equal opportunity. They don't. And I'm not even getting into suspensions and expulsion and things like that that hit African-American students real hard. I was actually astonished to learn that over 50% of the pre-K students who are suspended, now pre-K, we're talking about 4 and 5 years old, are African-American students. And you go, suspended 4 and 5? And then you realize that it is part and parcel of this whole policing of African-American communities. I mean, we've seen cases where they tried to arrest 5 years old, handcuff 5 years old. And so you have activities in the schools that lead to higher rates of suspension and expulsions. A friend and colleague, Sean Hopper, did a study of suspensions and expulsions and discovered that in some districts in the South, 100% of the suspensions were African-American students. How can you have 100% on one ethnic group and the other ethnic group is totally excluded? And so there's much to work on. There's much that we can actually fix. These things do not have to continue. But the first thing, you know, it's like Alcohol Anonymous. First thing you have to admit, you have to acknowledge the problem before you can even think about cure. And so we have to go through step by step and acknowledge the inequalities that affect not only African-American students, but Latinx students as well. And because they are becoming the majority of American school population. I know in Illinois already, they're close to 45% of the school population. Our colleges, our universities, our business, our industries looking forward are going to have to draw their talent from the very students that are being denied an equal education. And then, and our military as well. And so we need to get on this problem. We need to fix this problem because it's not just about these communities anymore. And if it was only about them, we would still have a great obligation to fix it because we're talking about communities that have been mistreated historically, but it's about our business, it's about our military, it's about the future of this nation. You cannot continue to a failure to educate populations that are becoming the majority of the school population.
Yeah, and I feel like one of the things that I would want to add there, I think that was a brilliant way to think about from the point of the, A Nation at Risk, that particular study, and how when you actually disaggregate and look at the data, it actually tells a story about even in that moment that there are multiple school systems within the American school system that students are experiencing. And for me, the reason that I wanted to point that out in terms of the way that you laid that out and kind of move through time is because I can imagine some folks hearing the narrative about the difference in resource allocation between institutions and schools and thinking, well, this means that the solution becomes kind of doubling down on the promise of integration efforts, and that's what you need to think about. And not to say that that's not something that's important that we have to consider, but we also know that there are also important studies that have forced us to see how even when we have schools that are more racially diverse, and this was something I didn't really realize until I started working on some research when I was in graduate school in the Bay Area, and seeing some of the schools that were the most ethnically and racially diverse, but then when you go into the school and you see the kind of racial stratification that happens, not even just in terms of who gets access to AP courses and gifted courses, but then also things that are built up into school structures like academies within school structures, certain academic academies that have, you know, academic prestige and stuff like that, whether it be a science and engineering program built into the high school or a liberal arts rigorous curriculum built into the high school. And you see the, you know, that diversity of the school is not reflected in the kind of, you know, the kind of more rigorous and academically, you know, upperly mobile, you know, course offerings. Even this phenomenon that you know, Professor Anderson is naming, which is really about like how anti-Blackness expresses itself in terms of suspension and the policing of students, but also in terms of the way that certain students are kind of deselected out of more rigorously academic courses, even when they're going to schools that have these curriculum offerings and more resources, right? We have to contend with that even as we talk, you know, so we can look at different schools and we can look at the different school buildings, but then even when we have students in the same school, right, we know that there's not the same experience when we start to look at these other factors that are at play. And I think that this is where the narrative around Black teachers being so central to this story about how we try to work towards equality in school is that we know that, you know, based on many of the studies that we have in terms of Black students having access to African-American teachers before the 3rd grade, increasing their chances of going to college and completing college, right? But also, you know, there are the studies that came out that demonstrate that, you know, all things being equal between white and Blacks, you know, a certain group of white and Black students, that Black teachers were more likely to recommend those students for gifted and honors courses, right? And white teachers are less likely to recommend those same students for those gifted and honors courses. So we have to really reckon with those things that are not only about the material, you know, inequality of schools, though we have to take that seriously, we also have to take seriously the way that inequality manifests in these other kind of, you know, insidious and nefarious ways in the context of schools as well.
I'd like to say thank you again for those responses. Going into my next question, this will be going towards Dr. Gibson. What are your thoughts about restorative approach in Black education? Is there a history of restorative Black education that is useful for current education practices in Black communities?
Yeah, I think that some of the restorative work is, I think, hitting on the point that was, you know, spoken about earlier in terms of trying to rebuild some of the intellectual communities and intellectual spaces and professional supports that Black teachers had created that, you know, that we talked about being lost and undermined with that that moment in history where we see that rupture. So I think, you know, the language of restoration is very important, or even reparation, right? As Professor Anderson invoked, is important to think about when we try to make sense about how we, you know, do that work of learning to walk again and learning to speak again based on this very long period of sustained efforts to undermine Black educational strivings and efforts that have come since the kind of the post-Brown era. So I would say that that's part of it, but also the history is instructive because Black folks have always had to do the work of kind of restoring and rebuilding and reimagining. That's part of the story. He asks about what's the meaning of Black education. That's part of the you know, the narrative is Black folks working to create the institutions and the resources that they needed in order to help them get over, right? In terms of help them do battle against injustice in society, but also not just to respond to injustice in society, Black folks were also concerned about establishing their own standards of what good and meaningful life and good and meaningful education was about, right? So that's also something that we have to think about, reclaiming that that orientation to education, that it's not just about responding to external forces of racism and injustice, which is part of the reason that I don't like the language of anti-racism to a certain extent, because I think it only engages in the work of negation, talking about what you're negating. When Black folks have always had to do the work of anti-racist teaching, we know that that's essential to the history of Black education, but they also had to do the work of imagining and asserting a positive project as well in terms of what human flourishing means for Black people, right? Despite the persecution in the world that they have to deal with, right? Their own standards of what beauty and what right relationship means in terms of how we organize our communities and how we are in relationship with one another and also the world as well, right? So I think that restoration means trying to look back to Black folks in these more expansive models of education to build on, and then to use them, not just to replicate them, but as resources to kind of reassemble and build the kind of educational models that are most appropriate based on our needs in our time, right? That look different. And we have to recognize that, right? Even as we see resemblance between strategies of oppression and resistance to Black folks in their efforts to kind of exert political power and self-determination around their lives and to participate equally in society, we also have to recognize that we definitely live in a very different time. So it's not just about restoring things to what they were, but it's about reclaiming traditions and using them to meet our needs in the current moment.
So I would like to say thank you to both of you guys for, responding to these like very intensive questions. I would also like to say just, the responses of our history going into this idea of reimagining education. A little bit now we'll be going into Dr. Earl James talking and asking different questions. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nakaya and Chris, for your thoughtful questions. And we'll move to just another a brief round of questions for our guest speakers. And I'm thinking about the conversation and the discussion we had about current conditions of education and education practices. And I see sort of a continuity or a line, kind of historical line that I think both of you have drawn about our historical foundations and where kind of contemporary Black education and Black education practices are. So having said that, I would like both of you to respond to this question. So what specific education practices and interests, such as literacy or numeracy, could be citizenship, history, identity, humanness, or even respectability. So what practices and interests have been at the forefront of this Black education project, if you will? And what are particular historical contexts that informs those practices and those interests? And lastly, are there things that we should be mindful of as we think about their continuity, if they're needed, or their disruptions, if they are required?
Okay, maybe I'll take a first shot at it. And
Dr. Anderson, please.
From the time that I first started to study African American education, and particularly one of the things that struck me, and I was puzzled about, and that was just the whole process of enslavement and literacy in enslavement. How did it happen, and what was the motivation? And I was thinking, if you have been enslaved for generations, and we know from the historical record that by 1860, the average African-American family was in its 5th generation by 1860. And that meant that people have been enslaved for a very long time, over generations. And I was really struck and puzzled by why would you seek an education after 5 generations of enslavement? What would be, it's not to get a better job. It's not to go to college. What would be that internal driver? And the more I studied, the more I began to realize that what's at the forefront of African education has been there for a long time, is that they view literacy and they viewed education as inseparable from the struggle for freedom and equality. That has been at the core. People who believe that that to educate myself, and that, you know, we all know that saying from the older folk in the African American community: get a good education because it's the one thing that no one can take from you. And so cultivate your mind, liberate your mind, have an understanding of the sources of your discomfort, have an understanding of your oppressors, have an understanding of what you need in order to become free and equal. And the other things fit into that. Issues of literacy and curriculum, and even the hidden curriculum. And there's been a lot of work about that as well, where that has been so important in the history of African American education, because in many cases we had local school districts and states doing then what they're doing now, trying to ban what African Americans could learn. And so just like you see attacks on the 1619 Project or attacks on critical race theory, then it was attacks on other kinds of things to say, well, the teachers can't teach this. And so our teachers found a way to do that through a hidden curriculum. But all of it comes back to a core, and that is the people who believe that education was inseparable from that struggle for freedom and equality. And because of that, that commitment to freedom and equality have always meant a commitment to education. Now, has that been an ebb and flow there? Well, yeah, sometimes it has been, but we have to strive to restore that. We was talking about restoring those intellectual traditions within the community, young people growing up with that sense that they need to educate themselves, they need to train their mind, because it's not just for them personally, it's for the freedom and equality of the whole community. And, you know, we've seen this flower in certain eras. I was just the other day looking at the debate between Du Bois and Lothrop Stoddard in Chicago in 1929 at the Chicago Forum, where he was debating this Nazi and white supremacist on the question as to whether African Americans should seek cultural equality. But what was interesting to me to see the letters that were written after, where a teacher in the 9th grade at Lincoln High School in Kansas City said, hey, my class is gonna make a presentation on the Negro and modern civilization. Can we have your bibliography, Mr. Du Bois? They helped prepare the 9th grade. And I thought, what a wonderful world where the teachers understand that he's part of their intellectual community, he's part of their intellectual tradition, the teachers and others, to restore that tradition where we constantly discipline our minds, we constantly train ourselves, we constantly educate ourselves with the belief that if we're going to fight disenfranchisement, if we're going to become full first-class citizen, full participants, if we're going to become free and equal, then education has to be central to this struggle for freedom and equality. And I think it's important to always keep that in mind. I mean, sometimes we get on the subspecialists, whether it's literacy, whether it's STEM, whether it's math, or whether it's English. Yes, as educators, we can always do that. But I think for the community, for the churches, for the literary societies, for the debates, yeah, I think it'd be nice to have debates within the African American community about the 1619 Project. It'd be nice to have them to read it and decide what is right or what is wrong, or what is accurate, what is balanced, what is not. And critical race theory, these things, to restore this excitement about learning as it's connected to our welfare, our freedom and equality, I think we should keep that tradition going, because when all else fails, when you have no other reason to be excited, certainly you can be motivated for your own freedom and your own equality.
Thank you, Dean Anderson. Professor Gibbons.
Yeah, I feel like there were so many different points. I was trying to figure out which point I wanted to pick up on from what Professor Anderson shared. But one of the big parts about it is that, and I've heard him say this before, is that, how do you make sense of the people who are risking everything to learn to read and write when it's not going to immediately translate into, being able to apply it in terms of like moving for social mobility. It's not motivated by this idea of getting a job, so to speak, right? Though we do know there were some practical ways in which, enslaved folks use literacy in terms of forging passes, forging passes and things like, and those sorts of things, or reading newspapers. But what I get from that is that is something that's a very important message that we have to take, is that what does it mean when we don't lead with a utilitarian approach to education? That it's not pursuing education, and this is not to say that education is not supposed to have some direct implications for how you make a living and how you, and for the job that you want to get and that you're striving for, but that these were folks who were building a model and a relationship to learning and thinking and educating and imagining that had to do with more than just the immediate kind of material benefits that might come with education, right? It was a much deeper humanistic approach to what the power of education has for people who have been kind of persecuted across generations, right? And I think that that's something that we have to really sit with, and it's expressed in the idea of education for freedom. But when we really pull back the layers about that, that's something that's very instructive for how we do or do not organize ourselves in our educational models with that principle in mind, is that you can't lead with, this is what we're going to teach Black kids because this is what the job market is currently saying. Is that you can't allow the demands of the market dictate the values and the substance of the education you're offering to people that's supposed to be speaking to more than just their individual, material circumstances, right? And so that was one of the things that I think is very important about the models of education that we know is, Professor Anderson was mentioning the kind of collective striving that was fundamental to education. And that even bears out in the story about literacy. While literacy, for most folks, we think being able to read and write is a very interior, individualistic kind of thing that you do. You read in silence to yourself, you write your thoughts, interiority. But among the enslaved folks, we know that communal literacy was a vital strategy for educating folks, right? Even if one person who knows how to read and write means that you can read newspapers, right? Or text to people who do not have the capacity to learn, to decipher written text, but it gives them the opportunity to interact with literate culture. And this is something that comes up that I had to think about with Carter G. Woodson. His formative educational years, he was taught by his formerly enslaved uncles, but until the age of 20, he was responsible for reading to his illiterate father, right? Up until the age of 20. But even when he worked in the coal mines, every day after the coal mines, this community of veterans, of Civil War veterans and formerly enslaved Black men who worked in the coal mines with him, who couldn't read and write, they would pay him in the evenings to come and read to them from Black newspapers, Black books published by Black authors, but also mainstream white newspapers. And it was a kind of a collective communal literacy where they're interacting with and responding to the written word, even as they themselves can't read, right? Sojourner Truth has a quote when she says, I don't read such small stuff as letters, I read men and nations, right? This kind of literacy that has a deeper kind of political significance beyond just being able to interpret words that pass before you, but it has to do with the ability to kind of interact with the written word as a means of kind of expressing and exercising a political engagement with the world and expressing that agency within the world, right? And I think that that's very instructive for how we think about what the higher aims and what the purpose of education is supposed to be about. And that shit falls into things like civic education and all of that. Even, you have someone like Lucy Laney talking about the importance of learning, teaching the vote in civics education in Black schools in 1919, when we know that Black folks by and large are disenfranchised and don't have the ability to exercise the right to vote. Well, she's like, that doesn't mean you don't teach it. You have to teach these things because then they become instruments
and points of reference for students to know what the society is denying them, right? And Vanessa Siddle-Walker, I know, has written about this and talked about this very beautifully, but there are all these ways in which it's not about a utilitarian approach to education. It's about how do you equip students with resources to express their kind of human potential and capacity on the world, and to challenge the world to be more expansive and more inclusive, to fully be able to kind of express themselves as human beings, right? And to act on behalf of the human potential and desires of the communities that they represent.
Thank you. So at the core of reaching this idea of this sort of Black education idea is the role and responsibility of Black teaching. So where are we, what's the current status of Black teaching? And is there kind of, and what are the historical models? Like you talked about some of those. What are the historical models and the continuity of Black teaching that gets us to this kind of sort of higher meaning of education for liberation and freedom? Dr. Anderson.
Okay, you're not talking about the numbers, you're talking about the pedagogy?
Yes, as a particular practice of Black teaching.
You know, we're talking volumes here because, you know, and having experienced that, you know, personally, I do have that as a lived experience as well, but it's also something that that I studied, and as Jarvis was saying, our colleagues like Jackie Irvine and like Vanessa Siddle-Walker and others study this, but it's you know, it's trying to put into words how they took children where I grew up in the Black Belt of Alabama, and where just about everyone was in poverty. As we say, people I grew up with said we didn't know we were poor till other people told us, because everybody was virtually the same. But how those teachers were able to take students into their classrooms and in some ways shut the world out. One of the things, I'll give you an example. One thing that I always remember is issues of language, grammar, and dialect. We all had a way of speaking from our grandparents and from our communities. And no one would characterize it as grammatically correct or without a dialect. But once we walked into the classroom of our teachers, there was no scorn about how we spoke at home or how we spoke in the community. It was simply, when you are in school, you do as we do in school. I respect the way you speak at home. I respect the way, and when I'm at church, I'll be talking to your grandmother in a way that we understand each other. But when you walk into my classroom, there's a way to conjugate the verbs. There's a way to do this. And to take you as a whole person and respect each and every part of you, even as they would educate you, even as they will let you know, this is the practice of school. This is what we do in school. And to know how to motivate students without crushing them, without confronting them. One of the things that I remember about my experience, this actually happened to me in the 7th grade. My social studies teacher, Mr. McCampbell, everybody had to take an exam, and I did well on the exam. And when he handed it back to me, he stood before me, and he would either call us partner or young man. And he looked at me and he said, partner, if you're not careful, you're going to waste a good mind. I had no clue I was like, what is he talking about? Exactly, what is he talking about? But he kept repeating that. And one day it hit me that what he's trying to tell you, that you have a good mind and that you need to make something of it. Because I was just doing the assignment. I was just thinking about it. What I took from that was he didn't confront me by saying, well, what are you going to be when you grow up? Knowing that I wouldn't have known how to answer that question. No one in my family had been to college. My grandmother was illiterate, didn't know how to read or write. My mother got as far as the 9th grade, and that's as far as they would let students go at that time, Black students go. And so he knew my family, my history. He was not about to confront me with aspirations that seem unreal. But he had this nuanced and subtle way of motivating, of telling me, just keep going. Don't waste a good mind. You know? And the respect that I took from that someone who was so well trained and who was so professional and was so good at this job was telling me that I was good also. I mean, when you go through Black teachers, man, you'd have to write volumes about motivation, about pedagogy, about how they knew how to nurture and to be professional and to motivate students. The other thing, of course, is what they were teaching directly, and I'll start with this one. One of our teachers, English teacher, passed last year, and I called my classmate, or he called me, and we were talking about being in her classroom and all the recitations that we had to do in poems, and she was so particular about that, about if and the creation and poems like that. And then he paused and he said, you know, she read those poems to us as though she was looking into the face of God. And it was a spiritual thing that I remember. And I said, yeah, she got us caught up in those things, you know. And I said, even today, I could say, if you keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, you know, these are things that we still remember, things that caught us, gripped us, and motivate us. And we all struggle with reciting the creation. That's a long poem. And but it's one that calls for performance. It's one that calls for emotions and spirituality. And so they had their pedagogy. They knew how to teach. That's all. They knew how to teach. They knew how to motivate. They knew how to respect you and how to gain your respect for them. And as I said at the beginning, it would take volumes to really appreciate all of their teaching, all of their pedagogy, all of their motivation, all of their engagement, and how they managed to keep a bunch of knuckleheads like myself and others, you know, motivated is a testimony to their greatness.
Thank you, Dean Anderson. Dr. Givens, if you like.
Yeah, no, I just think that it's so, I appreciate sharing that information about how, you know, I appreciate one, that Professor Anderson speaks about this with the level of authority from the scholarly record, but also how he can speak from a very personal place of having experienced the pedagogical, you know, traditions of Black educators and the work that they offer. Because sometimes trying to describe some of the things that we're trying to make, that you would have to try to make sense of just from the written record only goes so far, right? Until you put all of these things into context and try to hold all of these different moving parts. But when I heard him say things like, you know, this teacher knew certain things about my family such that what he was saying to me spoke to me in a very particular kind of way, right? So this level of awareness that the teachers and educators had about the students that they're working with, and beyond a superficial level, it's beyond just an essential idea of how Black kids are, but this is about specific children who come from specific families in specific communities, and teachers who are responsive, not just to Black kids because all Black kids are the same. No, but it's recognizing them in the ecological context of the communities that they're coming from, and teachers who are also oftentimes a part and also rooted in that community beyond just the school, oftentimes other institutions that are a part of that school as well, right? So, but then all of these other different things that you have to talk about, where the poems are not just about learning the actual poems, but it's also about the spiritual resources that you might be able to pull on in these poems that speak to something particular about the lived experiences of the students that you're working with, and that you are, and who you see yourself in, right? And not just who you see yourself in terms of the kind of racial components that you're a Black teacher, you're a Black student. It means more than that. We have to think about how these teachers understood the shared vulnerability between who they were as Black people living in the world, in the same world, and the hostilities that also visited itself upon those students. So reciting poems like If and all of these other poems that you hear across Black student accounts, right? It's almost like they had the same teacher. is that we see teachers using the resources that are available to them, offering them to students to help them make sense of the world around them, but also to kind of do the kind of spiritual work that education is also supposed to be about. It's not just about subject matter expertise, but it's also about helping students to understand their self-worth and value as not being tied to the material circumstances surrounding them, right? So that idea of how these teachers brought students in the classroom, and I think he said, and shut the world out, right? Shutting the world out, shutting out the noise to allow students to engage in the work of imagining a world that had yet to exist, right? This is a very kind of complicated thing that's not just about you do X, Y, and Z procedurally in terms of your curriculum and your protocols of teaching when you arrive to school on Mondays. It's much deeper than that, and it's drawing on more resources than just pedagogical moves and new models of curriculum interventions and blended learning and things like that. Yeah, these teachers were well studied on those things, but they were drawing on something much more than that. And that's something that we have to be real about, and we have to try to account for when we're talking about this history. It's not easily translatable into the 7 tenets or the 7 things that you do to be an effective Black teacher or an effective educator, right? Human life and human striving is much more complex than that. Du Bois gives us this in Souls of Black Folk, right? To think about how human striving is at the center of the work that these Black educators were trying to do. And we have to appreciate the rigor of the work that they were doing, and to strive to kind of meet our own moment and, with that same level of rigor and commitment.
Great. Thank you. This is the last question, and take a minute or so to respond as we finish out the session. And I'll ask Dr. Givens go first, and followed by Dean Anderson in response to this question. So what advice and learnings do you have for educators of Black children and educators of Black communities that draw on a history of Black advocacy and protests? And lastly, given your scholarship, are there examples or exemplars of activism and engagement that have contemporary relevance for advancing Black education?
Yeah, one of the first things that I would say is I think that the history of Black teacher associations are very important for the conversations we're thinking about in terms of the recruitment and retention of Black teachers. I think that that history is very instructive for things that we need to imagine building, creating, enhancing in the current moment to support, fortifying a Black teacher pipeline, but also creating the spaces that are nurturing for Black educators, because we know that we can't have a conversation about supporting the needs of Black students without thinking about the role Black educators will have to play in that. So I'll say that. But the other thing is that I would just say that I'm a very firm believer that the kind of educational models and some of the traditions that we are talking about have relevance for the contemporary moment. And the reason that I've been so fascinated with the history of Black education was first because the resonance that the stories had with me in my own life, as someone who grew up in the 90s, right, in Compton, California, but didn't realize until I went to college that the fact that I had Black teachers my entire life was rare, right? And not only that the Black teachers that I had, I didn't put 2 and 2 together until I started studying these things in graduate school, but all of them had been educated in the Jim Crow South, and many of them went to historically Black colleges. The principal of my preschool through 8th grade was, raised in Lake Providence, Louisiana, taught in a segregated Black school, went to Southern University, began teaching at the Southern University Laboratory School. And the school that I attended when I was growing up in Compton, I didn't think that it was odd that we had to recite poetry and sing the Black National Anthem every single day before we started school, because it was something that I was accustomed to doing from the time I was in preschool up until the time I got to high school, right? And realizing that the the positive relationship that I had with education in my life, and all of my classmates, I think, would say the same thing, despite the fact that we were in a city like Compton that many people would think of as, you know, this iconic ghetto, right? But we had a very beautiful educational experience that helped us and gave us resources to realize that the meaning and the purpose of our lives exceeded the things that were surrounding us, right? I say that to say is that these traditions and these pedagogical models that we're talking about from the historical moment have resonance and have implications for the contemporary moment as well. Me thinking of myself as somewhat of a young guy, right, who can relate to some of the challenges that we see in education, but this is not just something that was in the past and doesn't have any relevance and can have impact in the current moment, right? I feel like my own life and what I encountered with Black teachers who are operating in this tradition, even as they didn't name it as such, right, I think is relevant, or, you know, helps me to understand that there is a way that this history can be applied and instructive for how we move and how we operate in the current moment.
Thank you. Dean Anderson.
Yeah, I would, I think Jarvis has covered a lot, and so I won't be redundant, but I will say, you know, what I would take and what I learned from African-American teachers, and I think it's important for everybody to know this, they believed they could teach any child. Yeah, they could teach African-American kids, they could teach any child, because they believe in their professional training and development, the confidence that they could teach any child. And I know this, I mean, there was a book that was written by Ramsey, looking at the transition of African-American teachers from segregated schools to desegregated school. And she writes about this one teacher who goes into a desegregated school, and the white kids are very disrespectful, mistreating her in every kind of way and letting her know that they didn't even want her there. And she went home, and she first thought as she was going home, if they want to be ignorant and not learn, I'll just let them be ignorant. And then when she got home, she said, no, I'm a professional. I have an obligation to teach them, even as they're being disrespectful. And she went back with that approach, and she taught them. But this sense is that this what you get is this notion that if there are children in my classroom or a child that I'm working with, I have the confidence, I have the professional training to make sure that they learn. And so one of the things that you often hear where people seem to have some skepticism as to whether they can teach African-American children, or to have some doubt or whether they can relate. What I get from African-American teachers, no matter the child, it's their responsibility, and they take it very seriously, and they're confident that they can teach them. And so one of the things we want teachers to have as they go into schools where African-American students may be a minority of the population, a majority, or the school may be all African-American. Anyone going into that school, if you go in there with any doubts about whether you can effectively teach them, you shouldn't accept the job. You have to go in with the belief, with the confidence that I can teach these kids, I can engage them, they're gonna enjoy having me here, and I'm gonna be successful. So that is the one thing I want everyone to keep in mind. You do not go into those environments like the one I grew up with any doubt as to whether you can be successful or whether you can teach the kids.
Thank you. What a great way to end this session. I would like to personally thank Professor Givens and Professor Anderson, not only for participating and providing such an engaging and informed and inspiring plenary session, but I also appreciate you for who you represent in a Black intellectual tradition, who you represent as educators and as historians and as race men of our time. This has been a wonderful session, so thank you. I would also like to thank our facilitators, Chris and Nakaya. Great job, thank you very much. This closes out day one of CUESEF of 2021. Thank you to all the participants and the CUE team for such a great day. Now we have 3 more days of equally engaging content sessions and presenters. So please join us, and please come back tomorrow morning. We start at 10 o'clock a.m. for plenary session 4, entitled Teachers and Youth, the Movement. All of you can join the links. You can find the links to the session on the agenda. So hope you join us tomorrow. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks for coming.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.